Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this professional learning opportunity. I am Scott Mathias from NCEA, and I will be your host today. Just a few housekeeping notes as people are joining. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A or chat windows. We will be monitoring the questions and will try to answer them all in the allotted time. After today's webinar, I will email everyone a link to the recording as well as an online survey. Once you fill out the survey, a certificate of completion for the webinar will be emailed to you. Today's webinar, Using the 12 Touchstones to Renew and Recommit to Teaching, is being led by Dr. Susan Abeline, Director of Coaching and Academic Services at FACS Education Solutions. Before I turn it over to our panelists, let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear Father in heaven, grant that we may come to you as your children. Grant that we may come to your Spirit, that something of trust and perseverance may be born in us for our life on earth. May we always be loyal and full of hope, working and striving not only for what is earthly, but for the tasks that have been laid on us for your kingdom and its righteousness. We ask all this in Jesus' name, amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Susan, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Scott. Good to be with you. I know we've got just a couple people on our webinar today, but since it's being recorded, and I'm grateful that you're here and that the recording will also get sent out to folks as well. The topic for today's webinar is using the 12 touchstones to renew and recommit to teaching. And I just want to start by kind of thinking back, right? This past Sunday, March 30th, was the first day of spring. And it was essentially 2 years ago that we entered into the pandemic and everything that came with it, depending on where people live and what your school did during that time. In some way, every school community was impacted by the pandemic. And 2 years later, we're in this season where things are starting to settle down in schools and school communities across the country. And it's spring. And with spring, it's a time of rebirth and renewal. And so in this session, my intention is to move us through an interactive reflection and discussion of the 12 touchstones of teaching and recommit to those practices that have an impact on student learning. So the 12 touchstones of good teaching, a checklist for staying focused every day, was written by Brian Goodwin and Elizabeth Ross Hubble. Together, they reviewed thousands of research reports and books and articles to write this book for teachers. It was published in 2013. And yet its lessons are still relevant today. Brian Goodwin is the president and CEO of McCrell, and there's actually a lot of great resources on the McCrell website in relation to this book, if you want to check them out. He's been at McCrell for over 20 years and consistently has translated research into practice. Elizabeth Ross Hubble, also an educator for 20 years plus. She's an educator, author, speaker. She's worked at many levels within education. She may be more well known to you as the co-author of Classroom Instruction That Works, the second edition of that book. The first edition was written by Robert Marzano, so that title is probably very familiar to you. So we're going to dive into some of the key takeaways of this book. But first, let's chat. Every teacher, we believe, has great strengths. And even every great teacher recognizes that he or she needs to work on something to become better, to deliver high quality instruction and to have positive outcomes on students. So in the chat, what would you say? What are the most important 2 to 3 things that you do each and every day that you would like to do even better? So if you wouldn't mind just going ahead and in the chat, what are 2 or 3 things that you do every day that you'd like to do better? All right. So it's really challenging to distill everything that we do each day in the classroom into a simple to-do list. You know, schools are very busy places. And over the course of 180 school days, it's unlikely that 2 days are ever alike. In fact, they're often packed with extras, things that make our Catholic schools very special in those daily and weekly schedules. And then there are occasional issues or problems among students and parents and teachers and even the parish. However, the authors do provide us with a practical checklist to cut through that noise, cut through the busyness, and bring even greater purposeful actions that will impact teaching and learning. So let's dig into these 12 touchstones and look at how they're organized. So the 12 touchstones are organized into 3 groups. The first group, items 1 through 4. According to the authors, they would say that as teachers, we need to relentlessly focus on doing what we know must be done and doing it well in every classroom with every student every day of the week. And so again, they offer us these 12 touchstones to kind of unpack the most important things that we need to pay attention to every day for every student. And so these first 4 items, I use standards to guide every learning opportunity. I ensure students set personal learning goals for each lesson. I think that the key there is students setting personal learning objectives for each lesson. The third, I peel back the curtain and make my performance expectations clear. And then the fourth, I measure understanding against those high expectations. So those 4 items, right, are around standards, objectives, what the expectations are for students, and making sure that those expectations are known to the students. And so that group of 4 items is in the be demanding group. So be demanding of self, be demanding of your students. And again, this is all around that idea of standards-based lessons and units, ensuring that students are making connections with the objectives for those lessons, and making sure that students are very well aware of your expectations with regard to that content. The second set, items 5 through 8, I engage student interest with every lesson. I interact meaningfully with every student. I use feedback to encourage effort. I create an oasis of safety and respect in my classroom. So with regard to those 4 items, they're in the second group. And the second group is be supportive. So as a teacher, we want to make sure that we are supportive to our students. What does that look like in terms of our checklist? Is we want to ensure that we are engaging, interacting meaningfully with every single student, using feedback, right, to monitor student progress and to engage them in the lesson, to ensure that they're working towards mastery, right? So we want to use a lot of feedback in the lesson. And then lastly, it's an oasis of safety and respect. So that classroom environment is one of safety and respect. So again, that's in the be supportive category. Our last grouping of 4 touchstones, items 9 through 12. I make the most of every minute. I help students develop deep knowledge. I coach students to mastery. That word coach is a great verb. I coach students to mastery. And then lastly, I help students do something with their learning, right? So we want to make sure that that learning is relevant, applicable, so that students see the value of what they're learning, the why of what they're learning, but they also know what they can actually do with that learning. And so that group, that final group, is in the be intentional category. So again, the language of the touchstones and of these three groups is very important. So with this last category, be intentional. As a teacher, we are intentionally designing those lessons from first minute to last minute, from the bell work to the exit ticket, and everything in between, working students towards mastery of those lesson objectives, ensuring that each student is connected with that lesson. So I want to be intentional about that. And again, none of us are perfect. We come to the table with great strengths, but all of us know that as teachers, we can work on something to get better. And so when we talk about these three areas, the 12 items on the checklist for each and every teacher to do each and every day: be demanding, that is, articulate and maintain high expectations for learning; be supportive, that is, provide a nurturing learning environment where you're connecting with every student; and be intentional, that is, know why you're doing what you're doing. Don't do something because the book says to do it, because the curriculum says to do it. Be intentional. Know that what you're doing is going to have an impact on students in the classroom. So there is a self-reflection form available to you, and when the deck is sent to you, you can certainly complete this self-reflection form. It's a simple Google form, and once you complete it, you'll actually have an opportunity to receive those responses and reflect on your responses, again, to determine which areas you want to pinpoint for your own growth. So I want to dig a little bit deeper now into these three groups. This first group is the be demanding group. And again, these 12 touchstones are an opportunity to reflect, renew, and recommit ourselves each and every day. And so as you look through these four items in the be demanding group, I'll just ask you to reflect which of these are areas of strength, which of these are areas of growth. So take a moment to read through these four items. And as you reflect, which of these are areas for strength? Which of these are areas of growth? So for each of these three groups of touchstones, I'm going to highlight an item or two, and actually in this one I highlighted three, and connect them to teaching strategies from other experts, primarily John Hattie, but he's also been influenced by others like Helen Timperley and Robert Marzano, Doug Lemov, others. So this quote here from Hattie says, "Research shows goals are important for enhancing performance. It's important to set challenging goals rather than do your best goals relative to student starting places." So what's important with regard to John Hattie's work, John Hattie is an international researcher, internationally known researcher. He wrote a meta-analysis in kind of his most well-known work, which is called Visible Learning. And in that book, Visible Learning, he did a meta-analysis of multiple research studies and determined the effect size of certain practices in the classroom. Right. So again, so as we go through these three groups of 12 touchstones, I want to tie in Hattie, because in Hattie's research, the effect size of 0.40 or greater is that tipping point to actually having an impact on student achievement. And so, so I'm going to highlight some of these items and tie it to John Hattie's work and some potential strategies with regard to his work. So within Be Demanding, I'm going to set the focus on items 2, 3, and 4 and go to our next slide. So with regard to this Be Demanding grouping, I'm going to make the Hattie connection. So I'll ask you to just take a moment to read what's on your screen, because there's a lot of content on the screen. So just give you a moment to read. Okay, so as you're looking at this slide, I'm sure you're picking up that it's kind of like, what are the look fors, right? So if I'm being demanding with regard to the 12 touchstones, right? So being demanding is articulating and maintaining high expectations for learning. With regard to Hattie, where that ties in is with regard to the learning goals, right? The objectives for the lesson. And also, what am I looking for with regard to students in those learning goals, the outcomes of the lesson? And so you can see that this is, again, how would we know that it's happening, right? How would we know that items 2 and 4 of the touchstones, where you're ensuring students set personal learning objectives for each lesson, ensuring high expectations, how do you know that those are happening? So on this slide, we're kind of seeing, what does that actually look like in the classroom? So the teacher is assessing prior knowledge, right? So maybe there's some sort of bell work where we're learning where students are starting from, or we're using the exit ticket data from the day before, or a quiz or a test. We're using some sort of data to understand where students are starting from. We're using evidence to differentiate learning goals for groups of students, right? So we're making that connection that not all students are the same. Students are going to have different types of learning experiences in order to master the objective, the learning goals. That the teacher is demonstrating a purpose for learning. So this is really about teacher clarity. And again, remember that 0.4 or greater has an effect on student outcomes. So what we know from the research is when we have teacher clarity, it's a 0.75 and higher effect size, which is great, right? So we know that if we present our objective with great clarity, we present the relevance of the objective with great clarity, we present the activities that students are going to be engaging in with great clarity, that is going to have an impact on student learning, right? So that's one of the great things about the John Hattie research, is it shows that impact and helps us to kind of double down on those strategies that are going to have an impact on student learning. And then the last one, the teacher provides realistic but challenging goals and recognizes effort towards achieving them. Right, so that's, again, when we go back to the 12 touchstones, I peel back the curtain and I make my performance expectations clear. Right, realistic but challenging goals, recognizing the effort. I peel back the curtain and make my performance expectations clear. So we're seeing that connection, right, between the 12 touchstones and John Hattie's work. And again, what does it look like in the classroom? Right? So as teachers, we want to set realistic but challenging goals for our students, and we want to, keep that growth mindset. You're not there yet, right? The power of yet, to get students to work towards achieving their goals, those learning objectives for the lesson. And so then, as I'm looking at my students, what are my students doing? Well, they're actively engaging with those learning goals to plan their own learning. What that means is, and again, how a great teacher can come even better, is not only are you posting your objectives and sharing your objectives with students, but really unpacking those objectives with students. What are those, what does the academic vocabulary of the verb in an objective mean? When you say explain, describe, by the end of this class, you will be able to explain, describe, discern, differentiate, apply, judge. What do those verbs mean, right? So helping students unpack the verb in the objective is certainly one way you can take your great teaching and make it even better. And then the other part is there may be some vocabulary of that content area in the objective. And so you might want to unpack that with the students, right? So it helps students to really engage with the lesson rather than reading it aloud or writing it in their journal for the day, but actually unpacking the objective with the students to understand where this lesson is going. It shouldn't take more than a few minutes to do at the beginning of each class, beginning of each lesson. What else are we going to see the students doing? We're going to see the students self-monitoring their progress, right? And helping them become more self-aware of what they're actually learning in the class. So self-monitoring their progress and providing evidence that they believe demonstrates they've achieved their goals. So anytime as a former school principal, when I would do walkthroughs in the classroom, be very mindful to not ask the question, what are you doing? Rather than tell me about what you're learning. What you're doing connotes kind of like a to-do list, a checklist of like an activity that they just have to kind of get done and call it a day. Whereas what are you learning is going to help me gain insight into the student's degree of mastery of the objective for that lesson. And then lastly, frame future learning goals based on identified strengths and areas for improvement. So this is really a depth of understanding of where students are at so that they are able to say where they are at with a particular lesson. I get it, I don't quite get it, right? In kids speak, that's how it would sound. I think I understand this, but you know what? I still don't get that, right? And so helping students talk about where they're at with their own learning helps create more ownership of that learning when we're creating self-reflective learners. So that's a little bit about John Hattie, and again, some of the research that supports these 4 items and the 12 touchstones. So teacher clarity, 0.75 effect size, and setting goals is a 0.56 effect size. So, and again, in the Hattie world, whether it's kind of goals that we think as bigger things or learning goals like objectives, right? So setting that objective for the lesson, 0.56. In other words, don't make the learning a mystery. Let's make sure we've got an objective. We're sharing it with the students. We're unpacking that objective with the students, differentiating their experience in order to master the objective, and engaging them in self-assessment, self-monitoring the achievement of that objective. All right, the next item for the 12 touchstones, the next group is the Be Supportive group. And again, there are 4 items, 4 touchstones in this group. I engage student interest. I interact meaningfully with every student. I use feedback to encourage effort. I create an oasis of safety and respect in my classroom. So again, as you kind of review these 4 items, I would encourage you just to reflect and which are areas of strength and which are areas for growth. And I'm going to tie in number 7 specifically, and some research that John Hattie and Helen Timperley did, where they, this is just a paraphrase of it, studies with the highest effect sizes involve students receiving feedback about a task and how to do it more effectively. Feedback in the form of praise, punishment, and rewards has lower effect sizes. right? So if we want to really have an impact in terms of student learning, the focus here, again, great teachers, great strengths, kind of taking that to the next level, is to reconsider feedback and how you give feedback to students in the classroom. You know, we love the Carol Dweck research and the growth mindset, and we're not quite there yet in our learning, but there's even more that we can do with regard to feedback. So I'll give you a moment to review what's on this slide. Again, notice the organization here. What does it look like in the classroom from the teacher's perspective and the student's perspective? I'll give you a moment to read what's on this slide. Okay, so with regard to the Be Supportive group, right, there's again four items, 4 touchstones within Be Supportive: engagement, interaction, feedback, safety, and respect. But again, I want to focus on this idea of feedback. And feedback informs the student as well as the teacher about the student's performance relative to their learning goals, their objectives. Right, so if you think of a 45-minute lesson or a 90-minute lesson, we want to intentionally integrate feedback throughout the lesson. As teachers, we do this all the time. You know, we're constantly observing our students and saying something to them, right, and engaging with them in some way. The point of this and the point of the 12 touchstones is to take that great teaching and bring it even and make it even better. So what does it look like? So the teacher provides feedback on tasks and that challenges students to review, reflect, and refine their understandings. It's not a, okay, you get it, we can move on. It's having that conversation about the learning, taking it a step further, making sure that students understanding 100%. That's a Doug Lemov strategy, the 100%. You know, 95% isn't good enough. If you're giving feedback, let's get them to 100% of understanding, of mastery of that objective. So I want to continually review, reflect, refine their understandings, get them to that complete mastery. Remember, high expectations in that Be Demanding group, right? You want to set high expectations, maintain those high expectations. So when you're giving feedback, keep those high expectations in mind and offer feedback that has students review, reflect, refine their understandings. The next bullet is timely feedback. So it should be in the context of the lesson, or if you're giving assignments or assessments, you know, within a reasonable amount of time so that that learning is still fresh. So we don't want you know, assignments or assessment feedback to go weeks. Honestly, we don't want it to go more than a couple of days. We want to give immediate feedback. So the research suggests that feedback to students should be kind, specific, timely, accurate, and very clear to the students that are receiving that feedback. And then lastly, uses student assessment data as a source of feedback on the effectiveness of your own teaching practice. So where are you hitting the mark? This is not a judgment of good or bad. That's not what this is about. This is about using the data to figure out which students still have gaps. I got to close those gaps. So it's a reflecting on, okay, this teaching method didn't work for this group of students because they still don't get it. We're going to talk about that more in a couple of slides. But using that feedback, you know, when you give an assignment, when you give an assessment, if you have, you know, half the students are at average, you know, you might say, gosh, okay, what do I need to do differently? How do I reassess those students? How do I address that learning again because I've got kids that aren't getting it. And I can't teach it the same way because they didn't get it the way that I taught it before. So I've got to teach it in a different way in order for them to master or, progress towards mastery of that content. So we want to use that student assessment data as a source of feedback for us on what's been effective and what's not effective, right? So when you get that assignment, that assessment data, you're going to have students that got A's and B's. Okay, how did you teach, right? That worked for those students. Now let's look at what didn't work. And is there something that you can do differently in order to meet the needs of the students that are not meeting mastery? What does it look for students in terms of be supportive with regard to feedback? If students are receiving feedback well, then they understand what they need to do to improve. If students are receiving kind, specific, accurate, timely, clear feedback, then they know what they need to do in order to improve. I've witnessed a lot of great teachers, and there's some great teachers that I've seen that are like, kings and queens of the thesaurus. They're able to say things in 5 different ways, in order for a student to like, oh, the 5th way, they understood it, right? So when we're giving feedback, we need to make sure that we are giving that feedback so that they know what to do to improve, that they feel encouraged and supportive. Again, that aligns with this be supportive, these 4 touchstones, and that they use the feedback to monitor and self-regulate. So whether it's the verbal feedback that they're getting from you, or whether it's feedback on assignments or assessments, that they can actually monitor their own progress around unit goals that you might have, or kind of sets of objectives that you might have. But they can use that feedback to kind of check where they are with regard to their learning. Again, empowering them to be more self-aware and own their learning. With regard to feedback and the effect size, it's a 0.73 effect size. So we know that feedback has a pretty powerful impact on student learning. All right, the last set of items is be intentional. And for these 4 touchstones, again, I make the most of every minute. I help students develop deep knowledge. I coach students for mastery. I help students do something with their learning, right? So this be intentional, especially number 10 and 11, they tie back to that idea of feedback, right? Under the first bullet under the teacher, provides feedback on the task that challenges students to review, reflect, refine their understanding. Students understand what they need to improve. So this idea, these 12 touchstones, they're intertwined, but we can be intentional in terms of coaching students to that mastery through our feedback, and helping students develop deep knowledge through our feedback. But there's other ways we can do this as well, and I'm going to touch on that now. Again, with regard to John Hattie, this phrase of multiple exposures. Multiple exposures provide students with multiple opportunities to encounter, engage with, and elaborate on new knowledge and skills. It is not simple repetition or drill work to get to that deep knowledge. Okay, so take a moment to reflect on these 4 items, 9, 10, 11, 12, these 4 touchstones, which are areas of strength for you, and which are areas in which you want to grow on. Take a moment. Okay, so I want to drill down into this 3rd group, be intentional, and the Hattie connection. And again, I'm tying this to these 2 items, item 10 and 11, touchstones 10 and 11. You help students develop deep knowledge, coaching students to mastery through this notion of multiple exposures. So I'll give you a moment to read what's on the slide, and then I'll unpack it. Okay, so when you see this phrase kind of multiple exposures, you might be drawn towards the notion of gradual release of responsibility and the Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry work, I do, we do, to do, you do, that kind of methodology, which is smart, right? That definitely aligns here with Hattie's work. Research shows that deep learning is developed over time via multiple and spaced interactions with new knowledge and concepts. So multiple and spaced, excuse me, interactions. So this idea of multiple exposures, yes, it's I do, we do, to do, you do, in whatever order, doesn't matter. It's those multiple exposures to mastery, to master the objective, to master those learning goals. And the effect size of this idea, this practice, is time on task has a 0.62 effect size, right? So again, greater than 0.4. And so therefore it has an impact on student learning. And then spaced practice has a 0.73 effect size, which again, greater than 0.40. So it has an impact on student learning. So what I think we need to think about is, if you're already doing gradual release of responsibility and within the context of your lesson, you have different types of experiences for students to try to master that objective. And so the experience is not only, it shouldn't be the same from I, we, to, and you, right? It should be different ways in which students are going to get to mastery. So it links multiple exposures to learning goals. So certainly, again, gradual release of responsibility is a great way to go. I would just encourage you to think of, so for my gradual release, is it essentially I'm modeling it, and then together we're doing the same thing that I just modeled in the same way, and then students are doing it in pairs in the same way that I modeled it and we did it together, and then independently they're doing it and practicing it in the same way that I did it, right? So are all 4 exposures of gradual release the same type of exposure but with different people? And so if that's the case, that could be effective for some students, right? And you'd want to use your assessment data to determine whether or not your checks for understanding during class, or your exit ticket at the end of class, or the quiz or whatever, you'd want to use that information to help you know, did that work? Did that exposure? It was the same exposure, essentially, but 4 different people were giving that exposure. It was either the teacher with the class, the students together, or the students independently. It was the same type of learning experience, but 4 different voices, so to speak, engaged in that. Did that work? If it did, great. But if it didn't, then let's ponder, let's think about, what types of experiences could my students have in order to master that objective? How might it look different from lesson to lesson, or from within a lesson, which is the important part of the spaced practice that Hattie talks about. You know, when we write lessons, we tend to say, you know, an objective per day, or an objective every few days. And we kind of build off that learning, right? It may take, and we all know this because we've been in the classroom, it may take longer, right, for some students to master that objective. So that spaced practice, that opportunity to practice, to come back to it, to practice, that idea of spiraling, so that students, it's not kind of like a one and done. Okay, check, got that objective mastered, I'm moving on to the next one, but that they progress, they build on one another, so that students have opportunities to continue to practice, so that learning doesn't go away, right? Which ties to this idea of item number 10, deep knowledge. So it's not, and Hattie talks about this too, he talks about surface and deep. So it's not this simple repetition or drill work and be like, okay, they know their times tables, we're done, we're never doing times tables again. Or they know their subject verb agreement, we never have to have a grammar lesson on subject verb agreement again. It's we have that multiple practice of skills, so that students, they really become integrated into their learning, and they get to use those skills over and over again. Okay. The second bullet under teachers, they plan units of work that clearly identify new knowledge and skills that will benefit from multiple exposures. So in other words, not every objective needs, 10 exposures. It may need 2 exposures, 2 different ways for students to come to mastery. So as teachers are planning their units, they should consider, okay, this is a tough one. Boy, they're not going to get it through my I do, we do kind of single exposure kind of methodology. I may need to differentiate this. I may need to do a choice board in terms of having students think through how they feel they're going to get to that mastery. Right? Doesn't have to be the same way for every kid. So you may look at your unit overall and determine what concepts and skills within that lesson would benefit from multiple exposures, differentiated exposures to the content with multiple opportunities for practice. We know this when kids are learning fractions, right? It's not like a one and done lesson. They never learn fractions. I mean, God bless them if they do, but chances are they're not going to learn fractions the first time you teach it. And so it's thinking through how many different ways can I teach the addition of fractions, the subtraction of fractions, the multiplication, the division of fractions, or the relationship between fractions, decimals, percents, right? So it's probably not a single exposure, it's multiple exposures, multiple opportunities to practice. So, so thinking through those particular parts of a unit or of a chapter where you will definitely, in advance, you're intentional. You want to develop those lessons so that students have multiple exposures. And then lastly, uses a variety of learning and assessment tasks that vary students' interactions with the knowledge and/or skills and support the transfer of learning, right? So again, it's differentiated. There's choice boards. There's ways in which students can master that objective that it may not be the same as the student sitting next to them, right? And so in some ways as a teacher, we can't differentiate every single lesson, but we can intentionally differentiate those lessons where we know students are going to have different exposures and practice in order to master that content. In the student column, you'll know your students are demonstrating this strategy when they can consolidate their learning through opportunities that engage and re-engage them with new content over a period of time. Okay, there's a lot of words in there. So the idea is just that they can engage and re-engage. They can do it and they can reapply it. They can use it as they are coming into new content over time. So for example, if they learn how to look for evidence in informational text or in a piece of fiction, that they know that skill. They have that skill of being able to locate evidence within a text. They can do that in 3rd grade. Can they do it in 3rd grade, 4th month, 3rd grade, 8th month, 4th grade, 5th month, right? So that same skill is repeated month after month or year after year, particularly with Common Core ELA, or states that have adopted similar standards, that those skills are repetitive. They're repetitive, but they're repetitive with more challenging content. What an 8th grader reads is different than a 3rd grader reads, but the skill of looking for evidence, the skill of summarizing is the same. They're just doing it with more challenging text and using more challenging language to share what they've learned. And then lastly, the students feel supported and confident about their new learning, right? So as they're getting more confident, more competent in they're building their self-efficacy as they are, mastering content. So it's vital to offer feedback throughout this process. So it kind of goes with that idea of being supportive. So as you're going through these exposures within a lesson, to intentionally integrate feedback, and opportunities for students to also self-reflect on how they are moving towards or progressing towards mastery of the objective. So multiple exposures requires planning and structure. And again, I would start with your unit or your chapter and really determine what are those concepts and skills that I know students are going to need multiple exposures, different ways in order for them to master the content. They provide opportunities to engage and re-engage with those concepts and ideas and practice new skills in different contexts. This planned intentional repetition supports transfer of learning from earlier exposures to later exposures, right? So they don't forget how to multiply when they're faced with a new problem. They don't forget how to draw evidence from text because they've done it before. Now they're applying it to a new context. So just important ideas of with regard to being intentional. So a final note on the 12 touchstones, even the most dedicated and experienced teachers can benefit from having a strategic checklist to boost their effectiveness. These 12 touchstones are essential things that you do each and every day to deliver high quality instruction and positively impact student outcomes. The authors intentionally do not call their checklist a to-do list. They do not call it a to-do list. Rather, they call it a do-confirm checklist because they assume that people mostly perform their jobs from memory, right? But benefit from taking a time out to reflect, to stop and refer to the list to make sure that they've done everything that they're supposed to do. So rather than a to-do list, because we already know you're doing it, we do it every day. It's a do it and confirm it, and confirming it according again to the descriptions that the authors give us. High expectations for students and for every student. So with that, I just want to take an opportunity if you want to ask any questions. Otherwise, I just want to thank you for your time in being with me on this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A window at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will answer those. While we're waiting for questions to be answered, I just wanted to mention our convention for NCEA will be in New Orleans this year, and we are back in person for the first time in 3 years. If you want information on that or to register, you can go to ncea.org/NCEA 2022. Okay, I don't see any questions coming in right now, but as you mentioned at the beginning, a recording of this is going out to everyone as well as the survey. If anyone needs to have a certificate of completion, if you fill out that survey that I send the link for tomorrow, then you will get that certificate of completion. And I guess, do you have anything in closing, Susan? People can contact you after the fact for any questions they may think of after the fact.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. And thank you to all who have attended. And we look forward to seeing you in future webinars. Have a blessed day. Bye-bye.